Imagine this. You're walking through a forest, and every tree whispers a different word. Some call you failure, others say potential, and a few, in a hush barely audible, whisper nothing. The path beneath your feet changes depending on the words. You hear smooth when you hear hope, cracked and jagged when shame takes over. You stumble not on rocks, but on syllables, words. Now picture this forest is not imaginary. It's the world you navigate every single day. And the whispers, they've been in your head since you were a child. The ones you heard from a parent, a teacher, a stranger on a bad day. They didn't just pass through you, they shaped you. Here's the paradox. Words are invisible, weightless, and fleeting, yet they carve your identity, dictate your choices, and even determine what you believe is possible. Why does someone freeze when told, "You're not leadership material"? Why does another bloom just because someone once said, "You have something special"? Why can one phrase ruin a year, while another resurrects a soul on the brink of giving up? Language is the software of the mind. But what if the words you live by weren't installed by you? What if your thoughts aren't entirely yours, but echoes of someone else's vocabulary? We've been taught to see language as a tool we use. But what if it's using us? What if words are less like instruments and more like invisible puppeteers, pulling the strings of our desires, our fears, even our sense of self? You were given a name, then given labels. Good, bad, smart, lazy, worthy, unworthy. Over time, those labels didn't stay on the outside, they seeped inward and calcified into identity. But what is identity, if not a story told in words? You say, "I am anxious," not "I feel anxious." You say, "I am a failure," not "I failed once." Notice how the verb to be becomes a cage, a three-letter trap. Words are spells. That's why it's called spelling. And most of us are walking around under enchantments we didn't choose, cast by voices we don't even remember. Have you ever wondered how different your reality might be if your internal narrator had been kinder? Or if you had the power to rewrite the script? What if your depression isn't just chemical, but linguistic? What if your limitations are not physical, but grammatical? And most chilling of all, if words create your reality, who's really been writing yours? Pause. That question shouldn't sit comfortably, because if you feel a disturbance in that idea, it means there's something buried deep in the foundation of your psyche that might not belong to you. This isn't about affirmations or changing bad words into good ones. No, it's deeper than that. It's about decoding the silent, relentless force that shapes your thoughts before you can even think them. So, let's go further. Let's pull apart the structure. Let's trace the architecture of suffering, identity, and perception back to the source. Because before we can reclaim our minds, we have to understand who or what is really doing the talking. Let's strip the illusion. You think in words. You feel through metaphors. You suffer through stories. And yet, you never truly chose the language that shapes your life. Long before you had the cognitive tools to question, someone handed you a lexicon, a dictionary of meanings, limits, and labels. And without knowing it, you began to live it. Not just speak it, not just read it, live it. Language is not just a tool for communication. It is the scaffolding of consciousness. The late philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." If that's true, then everything you believe to be real, possible, or even imaginable is fenced in by the boundaries of the words you've been taught. Arthur Schopenhauer, the great pessimist, saw human suffering not as a byproduct of the world, but of wanting, of desire, constantly reaching for what is absent. But what gives shape to desire? Words. Desire is not raw instinct. It's wrapped in language. You don't just want love, you want the version of love that was defined for you in childhood. You don't just want success, you crave the story of success that society engraved into your mental script. And so, your suffering is not just existential, it is linguistic. Carl Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Language is part of that unconscious, not just what you say, but what you no longer even hear inside your own head, because it's become the default noise of your internal world. You were taught what to call a failure, a sin, a success, a purpose, a tragedy. These are not universal truths. They are semantic cages, and once you're inside, the bars disappear. You don't even know they're there. Consider the difference between shame and guilt. In English, these are distinct. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. But some cultures don't separate the two. Some languages have no direct translation. That's not a minor detail, that's an entirely different emotional experience, shaped by linguistic availability. Aldous Huxley wrote in The Doors of Perception that each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. Yet we don't. We perceive what we can describe, and what we can describe is what we've been allowed to name. Language limits perception. Think about a child crying because they don't yet have the word lonely. They just feel wrong, and until someone names it, that feeling remains a fog of suffering with no handle. Now think of an adult crippled not by trauma itself, but by the narrative they've assigned to it. A man who was abandoned as a child doesn't just feel pain, he tells himself a story of worthlessness. I am unlovable. A sentence becomes a life sentence. Jean-Paul Sartre said, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. But if the words available to make sense of himself are corrupted, then what is he actually making? A copy, a carbon print of someone else's vocabulary, a puppet whose strings are pulled not by force, but by definition. Even your inner critic speaks a dialect. It may sound like your voice, but it's been shaped by others' teachers, parents, culture, religion, advertising. It's multilingual, insidious, and persistent. It doesn't yell, it narrates, and its power comes not from what it says, but from how familiar it sounds. Nietzsche once said, all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. Interpretation is language, and language is power. So, who holds the dictionary of your life? Who defined your terms? Who made you believe that success meant burnout, that failure meant shame, that joy had to be earned? And more disturbingly, how much of your daily suffering is the result of bad translation between what you feel and what you've been taught to name it. This is the hidden architecture behind your emotions, behind your identity. It's not only psychological, it's philosophical, it's societal, it's inherited, but it doesn't have to be permanent, because once you become aware that the words in your head are not always yours, you're no longer just a character in the story. You become the author. You're now standing at the edge of an enormous, invisible system. And the question is no longer whether you're trapped. The question is, how deep does the trap go? Let's go deeper. Words are invisible, but their effects are not. They linger in your thoughts, echo in your relationships, and silently contour your identity. Like wind shaping the dunes, they etch grooves into your psyche, pushing you into patterns you never consciously chose. But here's the cruel trick. Because you can't see them, you assume they're natural. You assume they're you. You don't realize how much of your personality is a side effect of how your internal narrator describes your world. You're not shy, you've been taught that silence is weakness. You're not lazy, you've been told that rest equals failure. You're not broken, you're just running on a syntax that was never designed for your soul. This is the architecture of self-deception, and it's built one word at a time. Language doesn't just influence your thoughts, it filters your entire experience of reality. What you don't have the words to describe, you learn not to see. It's called linguistic relativity, the idea that the language you speak fundamentally alters your cognition. Your brain filters your attention according to what your vocabulary can express. Ever wonder why some moments feel wrong, but you can't articulate why? Because you're missing the linguistic key that unlocks clarity. In 1999, a study on the Himba tribe of Namibia found that they could distinguish shades of green. Westerners couldn't even notice. Why? Their language had more precise words for green than ours. The result? They saw more of what we missed. Now flip that idea inward. If your emotional vocabulary is limited, you literally see less of your own inner world. This isn't metaphor, it's neurology. Your brain tags experiences with language so it can store and retrieve them. No label, no memory, no label, no pattern recognition. You feel pain, but without a word like gaslighting, you don't name the abuse. You feel lost, but without existential dread, you call it just stress. And when something has no name, it becomes impossible to confront. Culture knows this. That's why it polices language. It doesn't tell you not to feel, it just limits how you can describe those feelings. It calls rebellion madness. It calls rest laziness. It calls questioning negativity. In the hands of institutions, words become weapons of silence. That's how narratives become norms. Think about how the word hysterical was used to pathologize women's emotions. How primitive was used to dehumanize whole cultures. How normal became a synonym for compliance. Words build reality, but they also enforce it. Social media has taken this further. What once required deep introspection, grief, longing, rage is now condensed into hashtags, hot takes, and aesthetic captions. Our deepest feelings have been reduced to formats, templates, algorithms. But the algorithm doesn't care about meaning. It only cares about engagement. And so we speak in ways that get responses, not in ways that reveal truth. We optimize our language for likes, not liberation. The result? You speak more, but say less. You share more, but reveal nothing. And somewhere along the way, you forget the difference between speaking your truth and performing a version of yourself that will be approved. Words have become mirrors that distort instead of reflect. This distortion doesn't just live in public, it seeps into your private life, into your relationships, into your innermost self. When your partner says, "I'm fine," and you believe them because you don't know how to ask deeper questions. When your friend says, "It is what it is," and you nod, even though you both feel a weight neither of you can name. When you tell yourself, "I'm okay," because you have no better language for your numbness. These moments seem small, but together they build a life that is emotionally hollow, a reality that feels unspeakably wrong, not because something external is broken, but because you no longer have the words to make it right. The scariest prison isn't one you're locked in. It's one where the walls are made of invisible definitions you've never questioned. The words you use to describe yourself, introvert, extrovert, anxious, productive, worthy, unworthy, are more than just labels. They are contracts you didn't write, but signed nonetheless. And the consequence is a life lived in someone else's grammar. So here's the revelation, creeping in like light under a locked door. You haven't just been misled, you've been mistranslated. And now the question becomes more urgent than ever. Can you reclaim your language before it's too late? Let's explore the rebellion. You are not your thoughts, but you are, in many ways, enslaved by the words they use. So, how do you rebel against a prison that you cannot see? How do you break free from a system that speaks through your own voice? It begins not with shouting, but with silence. The first rebellion is to observe, to notice the phrases that loop in your mind without your consent, the scripts that play when you fail, the inherited definitions of success, love, masculinity, femininity, strength, worth. Who gave you those words? Who benefits when you repeat them? Stop, watch, don't edit, just listen. Because the words that keep you stuck don't scream, they whisper. They come cloaked as common sense. They wear the mask of truth, but they are often echoes of a world that never knew the real you. Here's the radical idea. Your inner narrator is not neutral. It is a reflection of the culture that raised you. Your vocabulary is laced with the biases, fears, and power structures of the world you were born into. To reclaim your freedom, you must rewrite the dictionary of your mind. Start with a question. What if the words you've been using are too small for your experience? You've said you're tired, But maybe you're disillusioned with the shallowness of modern life. You've said you're fine, but maybe you're numb from years of unreleased grief. You've said this is who I am, but maybe that identity was crafted from survival, not truth. You see, language is not just for communication, it is for creation. To rebel, you must become a creator again. That doesn't mean inventing fancy words. It means seeking deeper, more honest ones. Read widely, journal brutally, speak slowly, surround yourself with people who challenge your vocabulary, not just your opinions. And more importantly, replace performance with presence. Modern life trains you to speak for an audience. Your words become curated, filtered, polished for acceptance. But rebellion begins when you choose authenticity over applause. This is what the mystics, poets, and revolutionaries understood. When Rumi writes, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there," he's not just being poetic. He's rejecting the binary logic of moral language and inviting us into a space where experience precedes explanation. When Nietzsche says, "Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions," he's not being cynical. He's warning us that the labels we mistake for reality are often just inherited metaphors. And when George Orwell said, "If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought," he was sounding the alarm. Whoever controls your words controls your mind. So, here's your task. Disarm the language of your captors. When someone says, "Be realistic," ask, "Whose reality?" When your mind says, "You're not enough," ask, "According to what standard? And who made it?" When society says, "This is success," ask, "Does it feed my soul or just my ego?" You begin to rebel not when you scream louder but when you question deeper. You don't have to know all the answers, but you must refuse easy labels. You must become linguistically ungovernable. There is a power in reclaiming old words, in saying grief instead of sadness, longing instead of lonely, sacred instead of special. Each time you name your truth more precisely, you peel back a layer of illusion. You make the invisible visible, and in doing so, you begin to remember something ancient, that words were once spells, that to speak was to cast a reality into being, that your voice is not just an echo of society, it is the raw clay of a world only you can shape. You don't need permission to begin, you just need to stop reciting what was handed to you, and start rewriting what was meant for you, because the true rebellion is not external, it is internal. Literacy. The power to speak your soul's language in a world that forgot it even exists. You were not born fluent in your truth, you were born fluent in survival. But survival is not the same as freedom, and freedom begins the moment you say, "This word no longer defines me." Next, we move beyond rebellion. We enter revelation. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the rebellion ends not in flames, but in stillness. When the war against the false narratives no longer needs to be fought, because something deeper has emerged, something older than language, yet more precise than any word ever spoken. It is the moment you realize you are never the words, not the labels, not the stories, not even the thoughts stitched together by grammar. You were the silence that gave them space to speak, and suddenly it all begins to unravel. You begin to understand that language was never meant to capture reality. It was meant to gesture toward it, like a finger pointing to the moon. But the tragedy is, most people stare at the finger and call it the sky. You have spent your life trying to articulate yourself using tools that were never made to describe the soul, trying to express infinite, paradoxical inner worlds with a vocabulary designed for commerce, politics, and productivity. And that's the final trap. The most dangerous control system isn't the loudest one. It's the one that makes you believe it's you. But here's the revelation. Words shape your reality until you no longer need them. There is a form of intelligence that lives before language. The ancient mystics called it gnosis. Zen masters call it satori. Indigenous wisdom keepers call it the knowing. Carl Jung called it the self. Schopenhauer hinted at it through the will. And you have felt it, haven't you? in the moments between words, when the right phrase fails, but the truth remains, when a sunset says more than any poem, when a tear carries 1,000 unspoken truths. That is your native language, a presence, a pulse, a state of being that doesn't speak in syllables, but in sensation. The final, most powerful realization is this: language is your servant, not your master. You can use it to heal, to build, to connect, to name the unnameable. But the moment you mistake the map for the territory, the word, for the experience, you are once again asleep. Let this haunt you in the best way. Every time you say, I am, you are casting a spell. You are invoking an identity. You are collapsing infinite potentially into a defined role. So, what follows those two words? I am tired. I am not good enough. I am broken. Or, I am changing. I am not my past. I am listening. I am the witness. You don't need more vocabulary. You need more presence behind the vocabulary. Because the truth is, you can learn every word in the world and still be unable to say who you are. So, you stop speaking for a moment. You feel the breath rise and fall. You feel the ache beneath the thoughts. You stop trying to define the pain and you let it be. And in that space, something holy arrives. A stillness, a clarity, a return, not to a version of you, but to you before the words. And it is here in this wordless center that reality becomes yours again. Not the one handed to you, not the one you were taught to describe, but the one you see raw and unfiltered when you stop needing to explain it. So the final truth is not something you learn. It is something you unlearn. You unlearn the need to label everything. You unlearn the voice that narrates every experience before you felt it. You unlearn the idea that you are the story. You are not the story. You are the awareness that watches the story unfold. And in that awareness, a different kind of freedom blooms. Not the freedom to say whatever you want, but the freedom to no longer be defined by what you say. That is the power behind all words. That is the place they come from, and the place they point you back toward. You were never just a character in this life. You are the author, awakening mid-sentence. Now, the pen is in your hand. What will you write next?